Hello, everybody. Welcome to another story told from the Milledgeville Public Library in Illinois. This story comes from Europe, and it is a story that is very old and might be a little bit familiar to some of you and a little bit not familiar. So this is the story of the Sleeping Beauty. Once long ago, there was a king and a queen, and they had no children. But they very, very, very much wanted a child. And so one day, they found that the queen was going to have a baby. And they were very excited. And the king said, "I want a boy." And the queen said, "Well, I want a girl." And the king said, "Really, I'm not going to care what it is. As long as the baby is healthy when it comes, I will be happy." Well, pretty soon the baby did come, and it was a little girl. The queen's wish was granted. And of course, as soon as he saw that baby and he held her in his arms, the king didn't care that she was a girl and not a boy. He was just happy that she was here, and she was a very, very pretty baby. Well, in those days, it was the custom that when a royal couple had a baby, you would take that baby and you would have a big party for the baby's baptism or christening. And the king and the queen were talking about the party, and they decided that they were going to invite the 7 good fairies that lived in their kingdom. And the queen said, I think we should give them a gift. I think we should give them a gift of a golden fork and a golden spoon and a golden knife, and we should put jewels in the handles. And the king said, "That is an excellent idea. Let's make it a little bit better. We'll make a little gold casket, a little gold box to put the silverware in so that they can take it home with them, and it will be a lovely, pretty gift for the fairies." And the king and queen thought that was the best idea ever. And so they had the little silverware sets made for the fairies. Well, the day came for the christening, and all of the people came, all of the people that were invited, all the nobles and the ladies and the lords, and the queen was waiting for those fairies to come because she wanted to see the happy, excited looks on their faces when they got to see the pretty little gold silverware in the little gold box that they were going to get to take them home as gifts. Well, the fairies arrived, and the queen took them straight to their seats, and their faces were everything she had hoped. They were so happy to see these pretty little gifts that they were getting. Well, everybody got ready to sit down to the feast, and suddenly the door blew open, and in came another fairy. She was rather ugly, and she was dressed in a long black dress and a tall black hat. And she had a crooked nose, and she came into the room, and she looked about, and she said, "I do not see a seat set for me, and I do not see a set of pretty gold silverware in a pretty gold box for me. It is not good for someone to forget me." And the queen said, "Oh no, I'm so sorry. We thought you had moved on. No one had heard from you in such a very long time. We did not think you were still in our kingdom, but please, please come sit down with us." And she said, No. I shall not sit where I am not wanted. There is no chair for me. There are no gifts for me, but I will stay and give a gift to the baby if I may. Well, everyone was just a little bit uneasy by the way she said that. But they ate the feast, perhaps not with as much joy and happiness as they would have before the old fairy had come in. But they did eat the feast, and when the feast was over, they went into the room where the baby rested in the royal cradle. Well, it was the custom in those days for fairies to give gifts to the young princes and princesses when they were christened. And so the first of the good fairies walked up to the cradle, and she said, "You shall always be beautiful." And the next one came up and said, "You shall be gentle and kind." And these are the kind of gifts that only fairies could give. And this is why fairies were always invited to the christenings. Well, the third came up and she said, "You shall dance like the wind, light as a feather." And the third, and so on and so forth. They gave her beautiful gifts. She should sing like a nightingale and dance like a feather, always be beautiful, always be gentle and kind, and those sorts of gifts. Well, the seventh fairy, the youngest fairy, she was a little bit concerned. She did not think that the old fairy was going to give a very good gift. And so she purposely hung back as long as she could and did not give a gift because she wanted to be able to try to fix things if the old fairy gave a bad gift. And sure enough, just as the sixth fairy was bestowing her gift on the young princess, just as she finished, the old fairy pushed her way up to the cradle and she said, "You shall die. You shall die, die, die. You shall die the day that you prick your finger on a spindle of a spinning wheel, and you shall die." And she gave an evil cackle and she disappeared in a puff of smoke. Well, everyone was quite upset by this. And the seventh fairy, the youngest fairy, she came up and she said, Your Majesties, I have not yet given my gift. Do not despair. The princess shall not die. I cannot, unfortunately, take away this curse entirely, but I can change it a bit. The princess shall not die, but instead, when she pricks her finger on a spindle of a spinning wheel, she shall fall asleep. And she shall sleep for 100 years, and at the end of that 100 years, true love's kiss shall awaken her. Well, the king and the queen were a little bit upset by this. Of course, they didn't want their daughter to fall asleep and sleep for 100 years. They wouldn't be there anymore at the end of 100 years. But they were happy that their daughter was not going to die. And so they went on with their little party for their christening, and the very next day, a decree went out from the palace to the entire kingdom that all spindles and all spinning wheels must be destroyed, and they were all burned. Well, the princess grew up, and she was beautiful, and she was gentle, and she was kind, and she danced like light as a feather, and she sang like a nightingale, and she was a curious girl, and she liked to go about and see things and learn things from people, and everyone loved her so very much. And as time passed, the king and queen sort of forgot about the curse that the horrible old fairy had given. Well, one day when the princess was about 16 or 17, the king and the queen decided that they would like to go to their mountain palace. Now, they hadn't been to the mountain palace in quite some time. It was up in the mountains in a little, wooded area. And so they went up to the palace. And when they got there, they started giving their orders to make the house pretty and clean out some of the rooms and air out the place and get the food ready and put the horses in the stables. And because, of course, a king and a queen cannot travel by themselves. They must come with courtiers and servants and everybody else. Well, as they were giving these orders to get the house ready and make it comfortable and get meals and so on and so forth, the princess was exploring the castle. And she went through all the rooms and she was looking into all of the rooms and seeing what was in all of the places. And one of the places she went was up in the tower. And she climbed up the stairs, and most of the rooms in the tower were empty, but as she got up to the top of the stairs, she found that when she opened the door, there was a woman there, and she was rather old and bent, and she was doing something with a big wheel. And the princess said, "Mother, what are you doing? What is this wheel? I've never seen this before. What is it?" And she said, "Well, "Good gracious, child," because of course she didn't know it was the princess. She said, "Good gracious, child, I'm just spinning here with my spinning wheel. I've been up in this tower for the last 60 years. I just spin with my spinning wheel every day. It's what I do. It's my job." Well, the princess, as I said, liked to learn new things. And so she said, "May I try? I should very much like to try this. You said spinning? I've never seen a spinning wheel before. I would like to try this. May I?" And of course the old woman said, "Of course, child, of course. Come here and sit down." And so she moved out of the way, and the princess came and sat down. And she said, "Now, my dear," and she started to teach her how to spin on the spinning wheel. Well, the princess was so excited to learn this new thing that she reached out towards the spindle for something, and she pricked her finger. And the minute she pricked her finger, she fell down on the floor with her eyes closed, completely asleep. Well, the old woman was quite frightened by that, and she tried to wake up the princess, and she couldn't get her to wake up, so she ran to the door and she started yelling as loud as she could for help, and all of the servants came running. Some of them tried splashing water on the princess's face, and some of them tried rubbing smelling salts under her nose, and they shook her, and they poked her, and they called out to her to wake up, princess, wake up. Well, of course, the noise was so loud that the king and the queen came running, for they heard that something was wrong with the princess. And when they found her there, with a spinning wheel in the room, they remembered what the old fairy had said, that curse that she had laid on their daughter. And they knew what had happened, and they knew they would not be able to wake her up. And so they took the princess down to the sleeping quarters, and they laid her out on her bed, and they made her all pretty and smoothed her dress and smoothed her hair. And her mother was crying, and she said, "She looks even more beautiful now than she did when she was awake." And the father said, the king said, "I think we should send for the young fairy." And so they sent for her with one of their servants who could travel faster than any human being could. And very soon the young fairy came in her chariot of fire pulled by dragons. And she landed in the courtyard, and they took her up to see the princess, and she said, "I'm afraid she's asleep for 100 years. There's nothing I can do. But I can make things a little more comfortable for her when she wakes up." And she went down to the kitchen, and she stood in the center of the kitchen, and she reached out and she tapped the cook with her magic wand, just tapped the cook. And the cook, who was just getting ready to taste the soup, fell asleep right where he was. And the boy who was turning the food on the spit fell asleep right where he was. And the sewing maids in the corner who were just threading their needles to sew fell asleep right where they were. And that sleepiness spread out through the whole castle. The grooms in the courtyard fell asleep, brushing the horses. And the horses, flicking a fly off of their back, fell asleep right there, standing up. And the dogs and the huntsmen and everyone in the courtyard fell asleep right where they were. And then the sleepiness spread through the rest of the castle, and some of the ladies in waiting fell asleep right where they were. And some of the courtiers fell asleep right where they were. And the young fairy went back to the king and the queen, and she said, "I have done what I could. Most of the people of the castle are fast asleep. This is all that I can do, your majesties." And the king and the queen said, "Well, thank you very much." And they kissed their daughter, and they hugged her. They told her they loved her, even though she was asleep and probably couldn't hear them. And then sadly they got into their carriage and they drove away. They couldn't go to sleep too because they had a kingdom to run and their people depended on them. Well, they went back home, and over time, as time passed, another king became in charge of the kingdom. And just before, I almost forgot, just before the young fairy left the castle, she said, "There is one more thing I should do." And she went about and she made certain that a hedge, a forest of brambles, thorns, and pricker bushes and stuff grew up so tall all around that little house in the woods, so that no one could go in there and disturb the people until it was time. Well, after many years, 100 years passed, and there was a new king in charge of the kingdom, and he had a very handsome son. And this prince really liked to go hunting. And one day he was out riding through the woods with his huntsmen and the people that worked with him when he went out on a hunt, and they were all out hunting. And they came upon this forest, this wall of brambles and pricker bushes. And the prince said, "What on earth is this? I've never seen this before. We obviously haven't been to this part of the forest before." And one of the huntsmen said, "Well, Your Majesty, some people say that an ogre lives in there, and some people say it's a witch. Nobody's really sure. There's just always been a wall of brambles there." And the prince said, "Oh, really? An ogre or a witch that didn't try to lure somebody in? It can't be that. Come on, somebody's got to have a better idea of what this wall of thorns is for." Well, finally, one of the old dog handlers came up and he said, "Majesty, I heard a story from my father many years ago when I was a little child about a beautiful princess who was asleep in a palace, in a mansion in the woods. I don't remember why she was asleep, but it was a beautiful princess. I remember that she was sleeping and perhaps waiting for someone to wake her. I don't remember the whole story anymore." He said, "Well," the prince said, "a beautiful princess? Well, that sounds like an adventure." And so he got down off of his horse and he pulled his sword out and he started to walk up to that wall of thorns to cut his way through. And do you know, when he walked up to that wall of thorns, he didn't need to cut anything. They just opened up. And he walked through like he was in a little tunnel. And when he came through on the other side of the wall of thorns, he found himself in the courtyard for a big mansion. And it was the most odd courtyard he'd ever been in. There were horses asleep in the middle of slapping flies off of themselves, and the groomsmen were asleep in the middle of grooming the horses, and there was a dog asleep in the middle of chasing a cat who was chasing a mouse. It was very strange. And he tried to wake up a few of the people. He tried shaking them. Nothing happened. And everywhere he went in that mansion, it was the same thing. There were people asleep in the middle of things they were doing. The cook was asleep in the middle of tasting the soup. And there were courtiers asleep in the middle of dancing a jig. It was so very odd, such a strange sight. But he still hadn't found that beautiful princess that was supposed to be there. So he kept looking, and he looked through the whole mansion. And when he finally got to the tower, he found in one of the sleeping rooms, well, she had to be the beautiful princess. She was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and she was wearing a gorgeous dress. It was rather old-fashioned, but it was a beautiful dress. And so she must be the princess. And she was so beautiful that he just could not stop himself. And he leaned forward and he kissed her. And just as his lips touched her cheek, she woke up. And she sighed and she said, "I have been waiting 100 years for you. What took you so long?" And the prince and the princess started to talk. Well, as soon as the princess opened her eyes, the cook woke up and he finished tasting his soup. And you know what? It was very cold. And the horse finished brushing the fly off of his back, even though there wasn't a fly there anymore. And the groomsmen finished brushing off the horse. And everybody woke up, and the sewing maidens finished threading their needles and started sewing on their things again. Everybody woke up. And some of the courtiers came up to the princess's room to see if she needed her hair combed for the day. Well, the prince and the princess talked for most of the day. And by the end of the day, the prince decided that he was in love with the princess, and she admitted she was in love with him as well. So the very next day in the castle chapel, the prince and the princess were married. And he stayed with her for 2 whole weeks. And at the end of those 2 weeks, he said to her, I really have to go home now. He said, I want to take you with me, but my mother's rather jealous. And sometimes she can be a little mean when she's jealous. So I don't want to bring you with me right now. I think I need to do something to get my mother used to the idea of us being married before I actually bring you to the palace. But I promise I will come and visit you every single day. Well, the princess was a little sad at not being able to go back with her prince and live with him all the time, but he promised to come every single day, and so she agreed that was he probably knew best, and so she stayed in the palace and then the mansion in the woods. Well, every single day the prince came back to see her, and in this way 2 years passed, and by this time the prince and the princess had kids. They had a little boy named Daystar and a little girl named Dawn. Well, at the end of the 2 years, the prince's father died, and he became the new king. And since he was the king, he thought it was probably safe now to bring his wife and his children to live with him in the palace. His mother wouldn't be able to do anything to them anymore. And so he did. He brought them. And they were all so very pretty and so very sweet and kind that every servant and every courtier loved them. Do you know who didn't love them? The Queen Mother. She did not love the new queen or the little prince and princess at all. She was very jealous of them. And over time, she began to become a little bit more of an ogress and a little bit less of a human. She let that jealousy poison her. Well, after several years, there was a war. And the soldiers of the king were going off to the war, and they asked the king if he would please come with them and lead them into the war, into the battles, because they would feel so much better if he was there leading them. And so he agreed, and he said he would go. And he hugged his wife, the queen, and he hugged little Dawn and little Daystar, and he kissed them all very fondly, and he hugged his mother, and he said, Mother, I'm asking you please to take care of my family for me. I love them very much, and I would very much hate for anything to happen to them. And of course, his mother promised that she would, and all of this time, she had been very good at hiding from her son just how much she hated his wife and children. Well, the king rode off to the war, and the very next day, the Queen Mother said to the young queen, Bring Dawn and Daystar. We're going to go to my house in the woods. It's a little hunting cottage, little hunting house that I have there, and we'll be safer there than we will be here in the capital. You bring them along. Let's go. And so they left, and they went to the cottage in the woods. When they got to the cottage in the woods, the Queen Mother called her servant to her. She said, Come here. And he came in, and he knelt before her, and she said, For my supper this evening, I shall eat little Dawn. Cook her for me. Well, the servant was rather startled, and he looked up at the Queen Mother, and for the first time he noticed that her teeth were getting a little bit long and yellow, and that she looked rather ogressy. But he didn't really want to do it. And Your Majesty, are you sure? And she said, It's your life or hers. Do this for me. Well, the huntsman didn't want to die, so he went back to his wife in their cottage, and he said, Wife, what do I do? And she said, Bring little Dawn to me, and then kill a lamb and I'll cook it, and I'll be very careful, and I'll cook it in just the right way. And then we'll take that to the queen mother, and perhaps that will fool her. And so he did. He went and he brought little Dawn to his wife in the cottage, and she hid her away in their little cottage at the bottom of the garden. And she took the lamb and she cooked it up, and she put a nice spicy sauce on it, and she took it to the queen mother. And the queen mother ate it that night for dinner and declared that it was very good, and she was very satisfied. Well, the huntsman was very much hoping that that was the end of that. But as you might guess, it was not. The very next day, she called the huntsman to her, and she said, "Tonight for my supper, I shall eat little Daystar." Well, the huntsman was not happy about that, but he knew that if he said no, she would kill him. So he went back to his wife, and he said, "Wife, now she wants Daystar." And his wife said, "Well, bring me little Daystar, and let me see, he's a boy. Kill me a goat. We can take care of this." And so he went and he brought little Daystar to his wife, and she hid him away with his sister in their cottage at the bottom of the garden. And he brought her a goat, and she cooked the goat, and she covered it with very spicy sauces and delicious things. And they brought it to the queen mother, and she ate it, and she declared herself very satisfied. Well, the huntsman was very much hoping that was the end of that. But as you might guess, it was not. The very next day, she called him in, and she said, "Tonight, I shall have the young queen for supper, and then I shall be very satisfied." Well, the huntsman went back to his wife, and he said, "Wife, what are we going to do now? Yes, she's young, but she's 100 years old. The queen mother's going to expect the meat to be somewhat tough and yet somewhat tender, and how are we going? I'm just going to have to kill her," the huntsman said. So he took his knife and he went into the house, and he went looking for the young queen. And when he found her crying in the corner because her children were gone. And when she saw him, she said to him, "Oh, please, yes, please, kill me now so that I may join my children. I miss them so terribly. Please, I know what you've come for, and I know why you've come. Just do it quickly." And she knelt down on the ground, and she turned her head down so that he could get to her neck more quickly. And she was so beautiful in her sadness that he just couldn't do it. And he fell down on his knees in front of her, and he said, "Your Majesty, your children are not dead. My wife has them safely in our cottage. Come with me. I will take you to them, and, well, we'll figure something out to fool the queen mother." Well, the young queen, as you can imagine, was very happy to hear that her children were still alive, and so she gladly went with the huntsman to the cottage at the bottom of the garden. And the huntsman went out into the forest, and he killed a deer, and he brought the deer back to his wife, and his wife cooked it so skillfully that it was part tender and part tough, and she put some lovely sauces on it, and they took it to the queen mother, and she ate it, and she was very satisfied because she thought that her son's family was gone, and she would have him all to herself again. Well, unfortunately, about a week later, the queen mother went for a walk in the gardens, and usually she didn't go down to the bottom of the gardens, but this time she was a little bored, and so she wandered a little further than usual. And unfortunately, as she passed the huntsman's cottage, little Dawn giggled. And she heard it, and she recognized that laugh. That was Dawn. She knew it was Dawn, and so she sent her men into the house, and they brought the family to her, the young queen and little Dawn and little Daystar, and she brought them in, and she made them stand right beside her, right in front of her, while she had her men dig a pit in the ground and fill it with all sorts of disgusting things like vipers and scorpions and giant toads and things that would just kill people if they landed in that pit. And she had just said, "I want all of this family, all 3 of them, thrown into the pit." She had just given that order when who should come walking into the garden there but the king, her son. And she knew that she could not hide from him any longer, that she had become an ogress and not a human being anymore. And she was so very upset that her son might think she wasn't a good person that she, instead of throwing the queen and the two children into the pit, she threw herself into the pit. And she was instantly killed by all of those vipers and scorpions and ugly toads and things that were in the pit. And that was the end of the ogress. And the king came and he gave his wife a big hug and he gave the children big hugs and he took them back with him to the palace and he said to them, from now on, we will never be separated again. And as far as we know, they never were. And that is the story of the Sleeping Beauty. I hope you enjoyed it. And we look to see you again on Monday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time here on the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois' Facebook page. Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye.